Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on India's Unsung Climate Champions. My name is Manya Ranjan, and I graduated in 2010 from MIT with a master's degree from Engineering Systems Division. I join you from Gurgaon today. I'm a member of the MIT Graduate Alumni Council, and our mission is to find exciting ways to engage with our alumni all across the world. And today we believe that this content will help meet that purpose. From that standpoint also, really excited to have everyone on this call today. I'm very honored to have three brilliant MIT alumni on this panel. We'll be talking about the different aspects of India's unsung climate champions. And we'll get into those details very shortly. But just to remind everyone that the Q&A feature is on, I would request everyone to keep posting great questions on the platform, which we will take as we progress into discussion. Well, there is a Q&A section at the end that we have reserved, especially for questions that come in, but we might as well take some as we go on in the discussion. From an agenda, how the next hour will be spent, we will spend some time just giving some introduction and setting the context for the discussion. The meat of the discussion will be about half an hour of a moderated discussion between the panelists and myself. And we definitely want to keep some time for Q&A. If part 50 minutes could be long, maybe short, depending on the time the discussion goes. So with that, let's get into the first section. And before we get into that, before we get into the panelists, let me set some broad context about what we are talking about today and how we're going to go about it. First and foremost, everything starts with India's NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. And India came out with one target at the Paris Agreement. And the target has been progressively tightened as we have got a decent amount of success as a country. And therefore, I just wanted to level set everyone on what those targets are, what are we looking at, and what has been the achievement so far. So to look at this table, this basically encapsulates everything that has been done so far, announced and achieved. And there are two or three things that jump out from the slide itself, from this table itself. I mean, one is that a major shift in the amount of RE capacity will happen from 175 gigawatt by 2022 to 500 gigawatt by 2030. Well, that's a big change for a country like India. Second is the emission intensity, where in 2016, India signed up for a 20 to 35% reduction by 2030. That has been further tightened at COP26 by about 45% by 2030. So that's a substantial improvement in the target that had been signed up. And then some of the other targets like carbon sink or total projected carbon emission reduction, they continue to remain the same. And India continues to be on the path to becoming net zero by 2030, which is the stated goal. Now, with everything else regarding India, we end up achieving our goals much ahead of time. So I suspect that would also be the case here. On this, if I highlight a couple of things, earlier it's a few next. Yes, first and foremost, so just go back on the previous. Yeah, first and foremost, we are well on track to achieve the 500 gigawatt renewable energy target for 2030, which basically means about a 50 gigawatt of RE capacity getting auctioned and built every year. Last year, we saw about 70 gigawatt of RE capacity getting auctioned. We'll see how the built quantity keeps pace, but we are well and truly on that trajectory. And then, as I said, the emission intensity has been tightened further, which was a result of a pretty substantial reduction in the emission intensity target on the target that was set in 2016. And we might as well achieve this whole target by 2025. So there's a substantial progress on this item, which also informs the debate around energy efficiency that we'll get to in between. Next slide. So all in all, if you distill this into a neat framework, India, like any other country, has to solve three objectives together in the energy trilemma, if you will. And there are some unique elements around that for India. Now, on top post is energy security, which, as you know, ever since the Ukraine war has become a very important factor in determining energy transition scenarios going forward. And so India is actively working on reducing its oil, gas, and its derivatives. India is actively building resilient supply chains when it comes to the energy sector through PLI schemes and other import barriers. On the energy equity side, India has made the stated goal that coal will continue to be a part of the mix for much longer, given that it is an important part of energy equity for India. And in parallel, India is also working on enabling energy access for all, which means having access to reliable power for all, which is the next level of the goal that India has set for itself. As far as the environmental sustainability is concerned, there are two or three major levers. One being that India is moving towards electrification of all possible sectors, wherever possible, wherever it is of interest. On top of that, the electric sector will largely be underwritten by renewable energy. Some of those elements we saw on the prior slide. And we'll also emphasize a lot more on circularity and resource productivity, which means that we'll be reusing a lot of the material that goes out there. Another one of those themes that will inform the discussion. Next slide. Yeah, so as we go forward, as we all can imagine, India is a very, very large and a very chaotic country. And so there's a lot at play. But some things to keep in mind, because obviously we can't cover all in today's discussion, but hopefully this will be a thought starter for many future discussions. So first and foremost, renewable energy and electric mobility have gone mainstream in India. We touched upon how the trajectory has changed. Even electric mobility has gone through a very similar exponential trajectory. And partly that is the reason why we are not picking up these two topics for today's discussion, because they get covered a lot. So we have consciously avoided them. We love them. We really are very excited about their trajectory. But today we have consciously stayed away because they get talked about so much. At the aggregated scale, the utility scale, the deployments have taken a life of its own. So again, it's going at an amazing pace. The pace keeps growing. Another exciting story. So something to keep in mind. Capital deployment is also ramping up. So in line with point number 1 and 2, there's a record amount of capital moving into India. Many large global players are becoming active in India. Something Mudit will touch upon in today's discussion and what will be clear. With this, maybe I'll hand over to Anna to give her opening remarks, and then we'll go again to Arjun and Mudit before opening it up for a moderated discussion. Anna?
Right. Thanks, Manya. So we're going to talk about energy demand transitions in India and energy. So demand side measures globally have received much less attention compared to supply side measures, right? So Manya just mentioned that, we focus a lot more on renewables, but demand is one of the aspects that gets ignored. Demand side measures, however, can decarbonize at a much lower cost and also have more co-benefits with development compared to supply side measures. And in a country like India, it's even more important to focus on demand because with the rapid urbanization, we are seeing rising incomes. The changes in energy consumption are going to happen over a very relatively short window of time. So it's very important to make consumption efficient now to be able to lock in long-term, low-carbon consumption patterns. We see from this figure on the left that energy demand is projected to almost double in the next 20 years. However, with energy efficiency and also transition away from traditional fuels to cleaner fuels, we can cut some of this demand growth by about 50%. Right? So energy efficiency has huge potential in terms of locking in low consumption patterns in the long term. Also, India stands to gain most from energy efficiency compared to rest of the world. And we see from figure on the right, which shows that every unit of end-use energy that gets conserved leads to multiple units of primary energy that are avoided. Right? So we see these numbers for transport and building sector and overall at a sectoral level. But because India has one of the most inefficient supply chains, India stands to gain most from energy efficiency. Right? So, Emily, next slide. An important shaper of India's future energy demand is going to be how we cool our homes and buildings. Right? So India, unlike other large emitters, is a hot country with currently very low penetration of air conditioners. And with rising summer temperatures in view of climate change, so we are seeing unprecedented summer temperatures as we speak right now. Delhi and rest of North India had peak had temperatures last week which exceeded or were close to 50 degrees Celsius, which is about 120 Fahrenheit. Right? So India is going to need substantial cooling services to keep citizens healthy and productive. IEA, so if you see the figure on the top, IEA projects that by 2050, India is going to be the world's largest energy user for space cooling. The space cooling demand between 2016 and 2050 grows about 15 times, right? And a large part of this space cooling demand is driven by increased penetration of residential air conditioners. So we see from figure at the bottom, how the number of residential AC units is projected to increase in urban and rural India. Currently, less than 10% of households in India have air conditioners, and this is expected to increase to about 40% in the next 20 years. Right, so cooling is going to be at the forefront of India's climate mitigation as well as adaptation efforts. I think
Hi, Manya. So my slides are up now. Yeah, there you go. Hi. So thanks, Anna. She spoke about very well teed up what I'm going to talk about. Right? She said demand side management is really important in India's case. So a couple of data points there. Official government of India commitment to the world of decarbonizing our economy by 45% and by 2035. 51% of that reduction needs to come from energy efficiency improvements and 32% from renewables. So, compared to renewables, the targets for energy efficiency are even more aggressive. Another data point there before I dive into these slides is cooling. Cooling alone is projected to, have a peak demand of 800 gigawatts within the next 20 years. And India's total installed power capacity at the moment would be somewhere around 450 gigawatts. So you're seeing almost 2 new Indias of power just from cooling in the next 2 decades. So these are the data points that inspired me to start a business which focuses on sustainable cooling. Now, before we get into solutions, let's look at why there is so much wastage. There is more than 30% wastage in energy consumption in cooling systems. And that largely happens because if you imagine how a facility is cooled, right now I'm sitting in a facility which is going to spew out 5,000 tons of carbon every year just from its cooling energy consumption. Why is it wasted? Is because of the broken model. One of the things is the broken business model. So imagine there's a design consultant who's hired to design the MEP and the air conditioning system of a hotel or a hospital or an IT park. Now, those people are hired for contractual services which are fixed in nature. They have a lot of reliance on assumptions. They assume a lot of things and design the facility. And then once they design the facility, their hands are washed off. There's no performance-linked incentives for the designers of the facilities for a facility that is going to run for 50 years. Now, once so that itself introduces a lot of inefficiency. Now, this inefficiently designed building is then handed over to a contractor. The contractor is selected based on the lowest capex because everybody wants to reduce the initial cost of building a facility. Now, what happens there is that you choose the cheapest equipment. You select the lowest first cost equipment rather than focusing on the life cycle cost of ownership. So you end up locking in more inefficiency, not only in design, but in the selection of equipment that goes into the facility that's going to consume this energy. Now, third, once the facility is up, right, it's constructed, this poorly designed facility with inefficient equipment is passed on to a facility management company. Now, the facility management company also has absolutely no incentives on energy performance and very little capabilities. They don't know the T of thermodynamics. They are basically labor supply companies that have to run these facilities for long periods of time. So you end up with the system which has fragmented accountability and absolutely no incentives to minimize energy consumption and optimize for sustainability. So we can go to the next slide. There are 2 primary innovations that I believe are really fundamental to changing this reality of today. One is to make sustainable cooling the cheapest option to cool a facility by using long-term contracting models like cooling as a service. So moving away from this broken design, build, and operate and maintain mentality to actually paying for the outcome itself. So imagine today we don't build our own power plants, right? Somebody else builds it who's an expert at building it. They design the most efficient power plant, they run it really well, and then you pay for the power. So the concept here is that you pay for cooling, right? You pay for the demand up to a certain amount of tonnage you can consume, and then you pay per ton hour of cooling. Now, what that does is it forces the entire industry to focus on what matters, which is energy consumption. Energy is more than 50% of the life cycle cost of ownership of a cooling system. So if you move towards cooling as a service business models, the entire industry's incentives are going to be linked to minimizing energy consumption. So there are a couple of business models, Joule Pays and Joule Cool, which are related to existing and new buildings that we are pioneering the market. The other shift that I believe that needs to happen is to make intelligent automation a default choice. So obviously the largest part of energy and the carbon footprint of these buildings is in the operational phase, once the building is already built. Now, the operations are left to human beings with very little idea about thermodynamics in a system which is complex and evolutionary in nature, right? The cooling requirements are always changing. The system's health is always changing. The equipment maintenance requirements are always changing. In this kind of a complex system, leaving operations up to people to run it with their hands is actually super suboptimal. So to make intelligent automation the default choice, we need to cut the cost of automation in half. And the good news is you can do it with IoT technologies today. And you need to increase the value that automation provides by an order of magnitude. And the good news there is that you have cloud computation, you have AI, and that is able to reduce energy costs and actually increase the value of automation. So these are the shifts that I believe are really, really important to make sustainable cooling the default choice, and the quantum of impact that I think this can make is no less than a whole, like half in India to a full India's worth of power consumption over the next 2 decades. So thanks, man.
Yeah.
Hi. Always a difficult task to follow Arjun, who speaks very passionately. I'll be focusing on the material part. Of course, as Manya started, that renewable energy and electric vehicles have caught on. Energy efficiency is now the next big challenge to fight. But materials also are a large source of carbon emissions. Estimates say that every new piece of plastic, virgin plastic as it's called, embodies 2.5 to 7.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide for each kilogram of product. This can vary from LDP, or the various kinds of plastics. Metals can be much higher. So these are also very high, very difficult areas to decarbonize: steel, cement, and material circularity can reduce the amount of new metals, plastics that need to be introduced. So what are the ways of thinking about circularity? If you see the table on the top, it's just a structure and think in terms of thinking how material use or new material use can be reduced. You reduce material wastage during the design of the material. Let's say if you're looking at sanitized plastics, sanitized way to get liquids from a pack to the user, there's no need for wrapped plastic straws. Can we think of other ways to get that liquid? Just daily examples from our daily lives. Is there value in encouraging lower consumption? I used to like this line when I was living in the US, that brew at home, save bucks, no Starbucks. Or in India, if you're eating at home, no ordering every meal. Can you design the processes and consumption for circularity? Can there be fewer types and grades of plastic that are used in various consumer applications? Not everything requires a precision material. So there can be some regulation or industry self-regulation for using lower numbers of plastics, which can then be recycled better. And then finally, the design of infrastructure. So all of these problems have to be addressed separately. On the bottom left is an infographic which shows India's challenge. Something of the order of 62 million tons of municipal solid waste is generated around the country, and only about a fifth of it is recycled. And most of the rest, 4/5 either goes into landfill, which you see some examples of on the right, or it gets misplaced, which means there's some litter at various places. And and of course, there'll be some fraction which cannot get recycled, but there's still a long way to go when we think about material circularity. Can we go to the next slide? But I'm happy to say that some materials are being covered. because most new materials are energy intense, so they are also expensive. So there is value in recovering plastics and metals. So on the left, you see an infographic which shows various Indian startups. And this is the part about the unsung climate heroes. It's not Anna, Arjun, Manya, or I who are the unsung climate heroes, but the companies and the enterprises and the innovators who are tackling this challenge. So you see some companies working on things like cardboard, rigid plastics, low density polyethylenes, and so on. But there's a lot to do. One area which Bloom has identified and which we want to encourage innovation in is the recycling of photovoltaic panels. The chart in the middle of in the center, you see a large amount, it's a projection of how much photovoltaic panels will be discarded and will need to be recycled. On the right, we estimate that this is a large market, almost a third of $1 billion, just on the recycling. And it could be even more if there is some kind of regulation or if the landfills start charging to take PV panels. And this is in millions of tons. So on the left, you see the axis which talks about millions of tons of photovoltaic panels. I picked this topic up because this solar energy is often considered the holy grail of renewable energy, but there is an aspect of material load on the environment when you think of even the most benign of solutions. So that all of that has to be taken into account in the design of processes, in the design of the energy transition. But also happy to say that recent innovations have started showing an impact in some ways. The diagram you see on the bottom in the center is from a real-life application in a town in Western India, where AI-based image processing is being used to segregate the various kinds of commingled waste that comes in municipal solid waste streams. And that is now going to see a step function increase in the amount of segregation or the quality of segregation. The quality of segregation is just how well it is segregated. And so there is innovation happening. There is innovation required in some areas. And in some areas, good applications of new technologies will be able to help the recycling or the segregation better. And starting off with and ending with what I started off, which is that all material embodies value. And if there is a systematic way across markets and society to segregate, to recycle, a lot of value can be extracted using new technologies. And these are areas where we as in India hasn't seen as much innovation or as much traction as renewable energy and electric vehicles. But I think it's on the cusp of another such transition. So very hopeful, but also expecting a lot more innovators to focus on this area. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Awesome. I think that sets the context really well for the session. So maybe we'll use the balance of the session for a moderated discussion and Q&A. And I'm hoping that some interesting questions will also come in while we are having the discussion. So Anna, maybe I'll start with you. You spoke about the cooling demand and how it is not only required to go up, but also an imperative to go up, given how heat is ramping up and how India is struggling with that. Drawing on your experience from the policy domain and how critical that is, what can you talk about as examples of successes where policy led to good interventions in areas like this? And we can draw upon similar things as we look at the cooling wrap up in India.
Sure. So policies and policy interventions are key enablers towards achieving climate objectives, development objectives. So when you talk about successes in India, I think I have to talk about rural India and urban India differently, right? The energy needs, the aspirations, the challenges are very different. So in rural India in recent years, we have achieved 100% electrification, right? So until a few years ago, not all households had electricity access, which is like the first step towards getting any energy service, modern energy services. We also see millions of households in the recent years who have moved away from using traditional fuels like wood and biomass towards cleaner fuels. And traditional fuels are not just inefficient emission intensive, but also have adverse health impacts for people who use them. Right. So rural India is where currently the energy demand is still going up. Space cooling needs are immense. This is the population that has the least access to energy. So it's the most vulnerable. It affects health and productivity of people there. But I think we're seeing some success in terms of, more people having access, moving away from traditional fuels to clean fuels. In urban India, people are moving towards, there's an aspiration of improved quality of life. So they are buying and investing in more energy intensive appliances. More and more homes are investing in air conditioners. People who have one air conditioner is looking to buy the second and the third air conditioner, right? The story is a little different. The government programs and policies there try to incentivize people into adopting more energy efficient appliances. And once they have it, using them more efficiently, right? So it's not just technologies, but also behaviors that define how much energy people are going to use for space cooling and other energy needs. So just giving an example, and this is a thing that happened sort of in the last decade, is around 2013, 1.5 billion lighting devices were sold in India. More than 50% of them were the most inefficient incandescent bulbs. Right? LEDs had minimal market share. In 2015, government launched a program called Ujala, which helped sort of address some of the issues along the supply chain, help bring the price down. And within a few years since the launch of the program, the story completely changed. Right? Today, around 70% of the homes have LEDs. Incandescents have a very little penetration in Indian homes. Similar programs have been started for, appliances like fans, also air conditioners. They're more newer since these appliances are more complicated. Of course, there are more challenges with them. Right? Then there is a government program called the Star Labeling Program, which labels appliances from 1-star to 5-star, depending on how efficient they are. Again, getting people to adopt more efficient appliances. So appliances like refrigerators and air conditioners, this program is mandatory for that appliance. If the program is mandatory, what that means is that it sets the minimum energy performance standard. So you cannot sell an appliance which is below a 1-star. So it raises the minimum energy performance standards. But at the same time, the idea is to get people to move towards buying more efficient appliances or super efficient appliances. Right? So Arjun talked about new buildings, right? That's another thing that's happening is it's not just appliances and getting electricity services, but new homes and buildings are being built every day. There's an interesting statistics that by 2040, so most buildings that will exist in 2040 are yet to be built. Right. And so it's not just demand as people live and use these buildings, but also the demand for construction of these buildings. Right. Mudit talked about a material circularity. So we need to think, these buildings will create massive demand for steel and cement, again, very energy intensive, materials and industries. So we need to think about not just use and efficient technologies, but also sort of embodied energy and life cycle use when you're talking about services in India.
Sure. So thanks, Anna. Arjun, I wanted to bring you into this cooling question because it's a very important question for all of us. You talked about the innovation that your company has done on the cooling as a service model. I think there's also a question from others that talks about how do we deploy cooling at scale? And so what are the business model or technology interventions that you're seeing, maybe in light of this cooling as a service model, that you feel can really make a dent in this problem without breaking the bank for India's climate equation?
Sure. Thanks, Manya. The good news with cooling is that you can truly align people, planet, and profit. So, cooling as a service, as I mentioned, is the cheapest way to cool your building. And not only your cheapest way, life cycle wise, but even upfront. So I think the best way to explain is with an example. I'll give you an example of a hospital that is coming up right now in Nashik. That hospital is a 300-bed hospital. It would, in normal case, spew out about 4,000 tons of carbon in the atmosphere just from the cooling energy consumption of that hospital. The cooling in a normal case, right? If the consultant had already designed this building, the cooling load of this building was expected to be 1,000 tons. The consultant has obviously never operated a building. So they use thumb rules and they say, well, this require 1,000 tons. Now, you go from that, it's 1,000 tons, right? So you go from that into cooling as a service model. We designed the building based on the operational data of 50 similar buildings that we have. And we find that actually the cooling demand required is only 700 tons. You don't need the extra 300 tons. So what happens? The capex of the project goes down by 30% or more. Now, not only that, the system is designed so efficiently that the biggest cost, which is energy cost, is reduced by at least a third. So the life cycle cost of ownership of a cooling as a service or sustainably cooled facility is at least 45% lower than in regular case, right? And the beauty of the model is that the client or the owner of the building actually doesn't have to invest any capital. In a normal course of action, they would have to invest about $4 million into the capex of this facility. But in a cooling as a service model, that entire capex is being borne by a cooling company. So for the owner of the hospital, they are getting a super efficient hospital with much lower operational cost with zero capex. So that's the kind of example of how this happens. And I think the moment, the question was about how do you scale this up? So, the clear opportunity that I see to scale this up is to target the leaders in multiple segments which are heavily energy intensive, right? So, for example, data centers are extremely energy intensive and cooling is their largest energy load after the IT infrastructure. Similarly, pharmaceutical industry is very energy intensive, huge cooling loads 24/7, right? Of course, commercial buildings of all kinds. So what we have done is, and what we are trying to do again, is to pick one or two leaders in each segment and convert their entire portfolio into cooling as a service. And what we've seen is everybody likes to be first to be second. So once you convert one customer, which takes a long time, everybody else in that segment wants to copy because they know this is cheaper, right? And they know that the leader is doing it. So I think that's the way to scale. At least that's the strategy that we are following. I hope I addressed the question.
Yeah, no, sure, Arjun, thanks. Switching gears, Mudit, to circularity. I think there's always this question of, yes, there are interesting early models. They go to a certain scale and then things go haywire for them. And this also relates to a question that has come in from Sarah, where the idea is, what would it take for circularity to become at scale, maybe 50% of material circularity? Are there policy and capital interventions available that can help us to get to that scale? So that is part A. And part B, which is more of a social side of the equation. In that scenario, is there an impact around the rack pickers and people who are at the ground doing this with their bare hands today? What will happen to that in case we do see the stream scenario play out?
Yeah, okay. So I'll preface my answer by saying that we at Bloom have recently looked at this space in great depth and made a bet. So I'll share what we are thinking and what our hypothesis is. It hasn't been proven yet. And both the answers, the scale and the impact answers are linked, which is that material circularity will depend on adequate and good quality segregation. In material recovery, quality means good segregation. So that is the one-line equation we are working with. What that means is that no matter how good an outreach or social awareness, or public awareness, it's very difficult for people to segregate their waste streams properly, either difficult or they're not interested. And so there has to be both technology and process-based interventions. Process-based interventions which can either reduce the kinds of waste streams that are being generated at the household and commercial level, And technology like what I showed, AI-based imaging services. If you think about what a rag picker or a person diving into a dumpster is doing, he or she is also unfortunately segregating the valuable types of waste from those which are not valuable to that person at that moment of time or generally. And in India, a lot of this work is done by informal labor, often in very dangerous circumstances. So if you do have better ways of segregating the waste, then a lot of the rag pickers can go up the value chain. They can probably just do some or segregate some of the waste which the machines or the robots can't catch. And hopefully that will also reduce the risks that they face in their daily work. Hopefully also formalize some of the work. And then I go to scale. If you are able to get good quality segregation, whether it is by manual process or technical progress, that leads to scale immediately. And that's the bet we are taking. Again, I should go back to saying that we are still at the beginning of this churn. And hopefully what we are thinking is the answer will work.
Great. No, thanks for that. And maybe I'll stay with you for another question, another topic, which is while Bloom is doing great work and you spoke about the early bets you have taken, and I'm sure similarly other VC firms in India are also warming up to similar themes in the broader clean tech space. How do you see the capital equation coming to life, especially at the early stages? Are the global capital pools, global firms getting equally excited, or is it being driven largely by homegrown capital providers?
Yes, over the last few months, when we were tracking this space, we saw almost $15 billion of investments around the world in the waste management space in technologies. I'm not talking about CapEx. I'm not talking about new facilities being set up, but technology is almost $15 billion around the world, various kinds of new technologies, pneumatic, hydraulic, AI-based robotic arms, various kinds. So yes, a lot of capital is going there, which tells me that a lot of people, investors and founders, think there is value in this value chain. They expect to extract more material. There's also policy tailwind, policy support / regulation to reduce the material-based footprint, carbon footprint. So lots of moving parts, both on the innovation side and on the policy side. And I expect that to actually streamline even further. As Anna mentioned earlier, in India, now I'm coming to India, we've seen a few successful energy transitions. We've seen the LED transition, we've seen solar, now we're in the middle of the electric vehicles. So, and all of that is borne by the fact that India has very high energy and material costs. We import a lot of our petroleum, which is the source of both energy and plastics. And anything which helps reduce the energy bill excites governments, excites investors, excites founders. We've seen the incremental use of energy for growth come down by almost as much as half in the last 15 years, and that's across both governments. So there's a lot of policy support. There is also innovation because it is still expensive, and all of those paths are starting to converge. Also, remember, the large portion of the population is only starting to consume now in the last few years, and that is leading to a new generation of waste. So we are building a lot of these things, and as I say, in India, you get to build a lot of planes after you start flying them, and this is another of those examples.
Yeah, sure, Mother. Thanks. Maybe using that as a segue to you, Anna, as we're building planes, as we're flying them, I hope a lot of these planes will be built as the next generation is coming in. And you, as an educator in the space at IIT Kanpur, how do you see the dialogue happening in that part of the world? Right? We are, in a way, our generation kind of grew up with this problem and has found ways to address it. As Mudit said, we're building the plane as we're flying it, but hopefully they are much more adept at this. Is the curriculum supporting that? How do you contextualize that and give us some hope from that standpoint?
Sure. No, it's quite amazing to see the students that are in colleges and institutes today are very enthusiastic and very excited about this space, right? Energy and sustainability more broadly. So, we have been talking in this webinar, we've been talking about exciting things that are happening in this space. What are policymakers doing? What are entrepreneurs doing? So students are very curious. They want to learn more about this. They also are very excited about career prospects in this field, right? So just to give an example, so when we were students, or when our parents were studying, energy coursework was mostly students from traditional departments like chemical engineering, electrical engineering would go for energy related coursework. What we are seeing now is that students across departments are enrolling for coursework. So biology, social sciences, management, all types of engineering disciplines are enrolling for courses. I teach a course on sustainable energy in IIT Kanpur, and next semester we have close to 250 registrations across departments, right? It's a department level course, which, across the institute, people want to enroll for it. So there's a lot of curiosity and interest in learning more about energy and sustainability, not just coursework. Students, they have a lot of fresh ideas, not just in terms of things they want to learn about, but also ways of approaching it, right? Like students are coming up with very interesting projects that they want to do. So one student is developing an app to do e-bike sharing within the IIT Kanpur campus. So IIT Kanpur campus is quite huge, very beautiful campus, but very large. Right? Most faculty, staff, students all stay on campus. So he's developing an app to do that. Students come together to form groups and organizations. So there's a sustainability cell, which is a student organization, not just, I believe, at IIT Kanpur, but across a lot of institutes in India. So here students are organizing cleanliness drives. They're doing competitions across student housing units, or how to make the campus greener, more sustainable. Right? So then I think the current generation is also more environmentally conscious, if I may say, compared to when we were students. So example, use of plastics, right? A lot of sensitivity is there around it. I think we were growing through that, but I think I see students now actively sort of very conscious, right? So on campuses, you hardly see any plastic, right? People are using paper bags. They're bringing their own shopping bags when they're coming to buy stuff. Use around water use. So there was a very interesting student project, which a student was trying to make their student housing unit net zero water building. Right. So we talk about net zero emissions. They're talking about net zero water. And what that did is, as they were working with a faculty member on this, it helped create a baseline about the water consumption. Right, like Arjun was talking about that we don't, the hospital doesn't know how much it even consumes. We face that even when we are trying to make any type of projections, right? We don't have a good baseline. So student projects sort of developing into a full-fledged sort of a research thing also happens quite often. So it's a very exciting space. I think lots happening. They see, they read, and they want to know more, and they want to continue in this as they graduate.
Wonderful. We can see the excitement come through the way you're talking about this. Arjun, I wanted to bring you into this as well, because you interact with the quote-unquote next generation in various ways as well, in the other things that you do. What's your view on this?
Thanks. I think there's an opportunity that India has to make climate tech the next default career choice. Okay. And I think I really believe that that's possible, and I think that the student body or the young people are ready for that. Right? India, the IT was a default career choice. Everybody would to go into an IT career. I think climate is the next one. So what we're doing in our organization, non-profit called the Sustainability Mafia, is actually running 2 programs to enable that. And I'll just give you some statistics which are quite mind-blowing. We have a program called Climate Ninjas. This is a program to basically move people into climate as their first career from university. In our first cohort, which had 30 seats, we had 500 applications. In our second cohort, which had 50 seats, we had 5,000 applications. And then these people are like, and we basically assure them that they want to get a job in a climate tech company, and because we have 70 companies as part of Sasmafia, who are all founders. So they get matched into the right internship, and then, we ensure that they'll stay in climate forever because they're working with founders. So that's one program. Another program that we started, and this is talking to innovation, right? And, I think India's got lots of innovation. And by running the second program, I've learned about it's not just apps, but it's also like really good tech that is being built. So the second program is called Sustainability Ventures. You talked about money. We are giving grants of 31 lakhs, which will be enough for student teams who are innovating and want to start companies to survive for 8 months, 9 months, and maybe even a year. Now, in our first such ventures cohort, which is being taught in partnership with BITS, and the connection with MIT is amazing because what we're teaching there is actually disciplined entrepreneurship, which is Professor Bill Olett's book and the course that I took in MIT when I was there. They are teaching that same course in partnership with BITS. And in the first class, we had 53 students across 10 companies or business ideas, and 5 of them within 6 months have registered as companies. And I'll just give you a sample of breakthrough technologies that are being built. One of these companies is in data storage in DNA, right? Complete disruption. We all hear about data centers and how much energy they're consuming and all of that with the advent of AI. This company says I can store the entire data of New York in a shoebox if I use DNA properly, right? So they're working on very interesting sequencing of data into DNA and how you do that. And there's breakthrough technology that they're working on. And there's many such examples. So I am a huge optimist on this and also an enabler. I think India's next generation, we have most of our population is less than 30 years old. So I'm like an old guy in India, right? And Manya, you're a grandfather. So, most of the people are so young. And I feel like the default career choice being climate, lots of innovation. I think the gap really is in enablement, right? So the passion is there, the hunger is there, the ability is there. But, comparing my experience in the US to India, in the US, everybody's fighting for you to be successful, right? The resources are pouring in. If you're a student in MIT, you get grants left, right, and center, right? Here, and you have an ecosystem to support you. Here, you have to fight against all odds to be successful, right? So the level of passion, innovation, etc., can be similar, but the enablement is at least 100x less. And I'm not exaggerating when I say 100x. I've experienced both. Best college in the US, best college in India, there's at least 100x difference. So I think that's what we got to work on more is, proper enablement of these people. And that involves, non-profits. It also involves companies, corporates, right? So we got to get more action flowing into enablement.
Great, Arjun. Thanks. No, I relate to a lot of what you said, right? Because I myself have started on my own entrepreneurship journey recently, and I'm seeing a lot of what you're talking in action. So, Mudit, maybe I'll segue to you. And speaking of entrepreneurship and how people have to take extra initiative in India, I'm hoping that a lot of people listening on this call are also either on the other side of that or thinking about it on the fence. As one of the preeminent venture funds in that area, any advice, guidance you would give as people are thinking through their own action plans around entrepreneurship in this space?
The advice is independent of the space, which is when you bring your passion for a topic, the passion is very visible in your pitch and in your conversations. There are increasingly large number of funds which are open to deep tech, including climate tech and things like biotech, etc. We are one of them. I think Anna and Arjun indicated earlier that right now we are seeing some of the best talent take up opportunities in climate tech. So if there are people who are looking into this space, the startup ecosystem provides a very good methodology where you do a minimum viable product and then you seek funding to scale up. That model works in other areas and it works in climate tech. Whether you look at electric vehicles, whether you look at compressed biogas, that's how people have done scale up. So I would say make sure that you are listening to your customer and you build your first few iterations with that. In most cases, the customer will be able to articulate not the technology that they need, but what they are trying to achieve, and to build from there. And that is usually enough for the venture capital world to be interested.
Got it. Very clear. Very clear. I did want to end on a lighter note. We have had a very serious and an intense discussion. All of you have very important and busy roles. As we close the session, would love to hear on how do you unwind? What makes you relax after working on topics which are as critical and as important as these? Maybe Mudit, I'll start with you. And then for sure reading a journal, the latest scientific paper, and Nature of Science doesn't count. So please don't be false to that.
I've been a quizzer all my life. And in the pandemic, we got a quiz group going on WhatsApp. So that's my go-to relaxation. I also have 2 kids, 3 and 6, who take up most of my time. But yeah, if I'm left on my own, then my quiz group is my relaxation.
Nice.
And for the American audience, that's trivia. It's quiz is the word for trivia.
Yeah.
So I have a very active 7-year-old. So I think it's both unwinding and stressful at the same time. So I think that other than sort of work and reading science and nature papers, that takes up my time. Yes.
Got it. Arjun?
But I actually don't find work stressful. I find it pretty relaxing. If you're doing things that you love, don't really take much stress, right? And it's a source of joy and excitement. And I think the diversity of work is also very important. Like if you do the same thing and it's the same thing every day, then it gets a little bit stressful. But if your work has got a lot of diversity, then you have a rich life.
We should have had Arjun go first.
such a cliched answer is. No, but I can see that excitement as you speak about your work. Great. I think we are almost on the hour, and I've tried to weave some of the questions that came in through the discussion that we had. But it was great to see a lot of very exciting questions come in that, unfortunately, in the interest of time, we will not be able to get to. So leave it with me. I'll try to respond to you offline on the questions, and I've obviously consulted the panelists around that. But it's been a great discussion. I'm really amazed to see the amount of participation on this panel, given it's bright and early back in the US, and so many people joining to hear about all this is pretty amazing. I also wish that we continue the dialogue. I think while this session is almost like an opener of sorts, but we have a lot of threads that have continued from here. And I think Emily has posted our coordinates on the chat box. So if any of you want to continue the dialogue, have questions, want to engage further, find ways to work in this ecosystem, there's nothing more exciting than enabling that through this platform. And last but not the least, as a member of the Graduate Alumni Council, on behalf of Noreen and Emily, would also make a plug to reconnect with the MIT bodies, your co-alumni, find your clubs in their areas, and find ways to collaborate and engage. Happy to route your requests accordingly if you have any. But yeah, thanks for joining. It's been a great discussion. Really enjoyed it, and hopefully you got something good out of it. Thank you, everyone.